All I saw before me were acres of skin. It was like a farmer seeing a fertile field for the first time. This is a quote from Doctor Albert Kligman upon entering the Holmesburg Prison. For 23 years, Kligman carried out horrific experiments on prisoners who did not understand nor were told about the dangerous chemicals injected into their skin. This is the horrifying story of the Holmesburg Prison experiments. It's perhaps helpful to start with an introduction to Dr. Albert Kligman, which might explain his reaction to seeing the skin of prison inmates. Kligman was born in Philadelphia in March of 1916. He was the son of Jewish immigrants from both Ukraine and Britain and experienced a typical childhood, taking part in the Boy Scouts. Kligman attended the Pennsylvania State University, earning his bachelor's degree in 1939. Having a particular interest in fungi, Kligman would go on to complete his PhD in botany in 1942. Kligman then entered medical school at the University of Pennsylvania and studied dermatology, earning his medical degree in 1947. His interest was largely in cosmetics and minor conditions that affected the skin. He wrote extensively on conditions like athlete's foot and dandruff, as well as understanding and coining the term human hair cycle. Over his career, Kligman authored hundreds of books and articles on all manner of skin conditions, but some of his work was achieved through unethical human experiments on prisoners at the Holmesburg Prison. Holmesburg was built in 1896 to combat overcrowding in other prisons. Many of the prisoners were black, so too were the low-ranking guards. For Kligman, he would first be invited to the prison in 1951 to combat an outbreak of athlete's foot. At this time, Kligman worked at the medical school for the university as a professor of dermatology and researched nail infections. From this initial invitation, and through his helpful intervention, Kligman became a regular visitor at the prison, though not always with authorization. According to Kligman himself, quote, "I began to go to the prison regularly, although I had no authorization. It was years before the authorities knew that I was conducting various studies on their prisoner volunteers. Things were simpler then. Informed consent was unheard of. No one asked me what I was doing, and it was a wonderful time." Now, it should be noted that these experiments took place after the Nuremberg Code had been established, following the horrors of the human experiments of the Nazi death camps. The code was written to ensure proper and ethical treatment of human test subjects. One of the key tenets of the code was informed consent of the subjects, meaning that the subjects understand what they are agreeing to and of the dangers involved. Kligman was not alone in ignoring the Nuremberg Code, but the scale of the experiments he conducted was massive. All manner of experiments were carried out on the prisoners, who in exchange for small cash payments would agree to the trials. If any asked about the dangers, they would be told that it was completely safe. Inmates were rarely told exactly what was being done to them. Some of the tests would involve testing cosmetics. This could be wearing patches of perfume or beauty creams on the skin to check for any possible harmful reactions. One test lasted for 6 months and saw prisoners living off a milkshake diet, in what is understood to be the testing of early protein or diet shakes. With a large pool of test subjects at his disposal, Kligman was able to develop revolutionary new drugs. One notable example was Retin A, a treatment for acne, earning Kligman acclaim and the Pennsylvania University thousands of dollars as the patent holder. Some of the studies induced disease into the prisoners. One involved testing how inmates would contract ringworm, with large amounts of the fungi applied to the subject's feet, who were then made to wear boots for a week. In another example, inmates were infected with herpes simplex, a viral disease to which there is no known cure. The experiments were not just the whim of Kligman. Companies would employ the doctor to carry out experiments on their behalf. The well-known company, Johnson & Johnson, would engage the services of Kligman. One of their experiments saw the testing of bubble bath on inmates with open wounds. One survivor of the experiments was an inmate by the name of Edward Anthony. Anthony enrolled for a 3-week trial, receiving $37 in compensation. The researchers began by removing his skin using adhesive tape in the same spot over and over again. The bubble bath was then applied on a gauze taped to his back. This would be repeated every day for 3 weeks. Edward recalled how he could not sleep at all, and how it felt like there was something crawling under his skin and developing a fever. In another Johnson & Johnson test, inmates were injected with chrysotile and tremolite asbestos. This was to compare the effects with a naturally occurring mineral talc that can sometimes contain asbestos. 10 inmates were paid $10 each for the injections, which led to granulomas. Details of these experiments were revealed during litigation against Johnson & Johnson, dealing with their alleged carcinogenic talcum powder. Papers unsealed by the courts led to further light being shone on Johnson & Johnson's role in Kligman's experiments. So too did the United States Department of Defense engage the services of Kligman in the testing of chemical weapons. The hallucinogenic nerve agent by the name of EA3167 was tested on the prisoners. This is a non-lethal agent, but was one that was tested as part of the search for ways to incapacitate enemy soldiers. Hundreds of inmates were injected with EA3167 along with other dangerous agents in what is termed as threshold tests. These type of experiments allow researchers to understand the levels required for a given effect by slowly increasing the amount of the substance given and comparing the results. However, Kligman's threshold experiment with EA3167 saw massive increases in the doses given to the inmates, as much as 40% at a time. Side effects of these agents included damage to the nervous system, hallucinations, and mental impairment. One of the more controversial experiments was conducted at the behest of Dow Chemicals. The company had attracted attention for its pesticides, namely that one called TCDD that was causing cancer in fetuses. Dow Chemical opposed the government's ban on this pesticide and enlisted Kligman to prove the safety of their chemicals. At the prison, pesticides were injected into inmates to determine the threshold doses. Many of the prisoners ended up receiving excessive doses. This resulted in the prisoners breaking out in chloracne, a horrific reaction to the dioxin in the pesticides. As a quick aside, dioxin is one of the active ingredients of Agent Orange, a dangerous defoliant that saw use during the Vietnam War and was linked to multiple deaths and disabilities. Other inmates would be left covered in inflammatory pustules and papules, which would take months to heal. Inmates were given wildly excessive amounts of dioxin, surprising even the Dow Chemical scientists. Some of their inmates received over 450 times the recommended dose. The human experiments at the prison even saw radioactive testing on prisoners. Kligman applied for a license from the United States Atomic Energy Commission, which would allow him to store radioactive isotopes for testing on the prisoners. As many as 200 prisoners agreed to these tests, which saw the radioactive material applied onto the skin. Kligman would then apply various steroids and creams to test the regrowth of the skin. Kligman would later defend these tests, insisting that the radioactive material was not in the skin for a long time and was strictly monitored. However, the material used was banned for use in medical experiments in 1965. Even the cash incentives for taking part in the experiments worsened conditions in the prison. Whilst some saw the money as a way to support themselves or their families, some used the money for more disturbing purposes. Some of the money financed a system of forced prostitution and assault of inmates, creating wealthy individuals in the prison who exploited others in there. Much of what we know about the prison experiments comes from Alan Hornbaum, who worked as an English tutor at the prison. He soon noticed the researchers in white coats and the prisoners with gauze taped to their backs. In 1998, he released a book called Acres of Skin: The Human Experiments at Holmesburg Prison. It contained interviews with various former prisoners and detailed the extent and scale of the experiments carried out. The experiments were brought to an end in 1974, which was shortly after the details of the horrific Tuskegee experiments came to light, and Holmesburg Prison was shut down in 1995. The companies and institutions involved in the experiments have since apologized. The University of Pennsylvania renamed many of the awards or lectures named for Kligman, who had worked there and donated millions of dollars to the institution during his life. Johnson & Johnson too expressed regret for its role in the experiments, whilst also noting in its apology that such standards and practices were the norm at the time. Kligman himself never apologized or regretted his work, saying, "My use of paid prisoners as research subjects in the 50s and 60s was in keeping with this nation's standard protocol for conducting scientific investigations at the time." Kligman died in 2010, aged 93. Kligman was not alone in the testing on prisoners. It is estimated that by 1972, over 90% of all investigational drugs were first tested on prisoners in the United States. Many saw prisoners as a cheaper alternative to animal testing. Others saw the benefits of testing on a confined, controlled group of people who were often not society's primary concern. People in state institutions, prisons, and asylums have long been seen as a viable and acceptable subjects for human experiments. From Tuskegee to Vipome, the vulnerable are often used by researchers as unwilling or coerced subjects. The rather dehumanizing quote we started with shows how Kligman saw the prisoners as little more than material to carry out tests upon. This quote ought to act as a grim reminder as to the dangers of dehumanization and the vital importance of ethical research.